If you truly want to understand what this war is about, you have to look beyond the headlines and ignore the emotional framing that dominates most coverage. What matters is not what looks dramatic on television, but what actually changes conditions on the battlefield. Today, we're examining the Russia-Ukraine war through a strategic lens, focusing on real military effects rather than symbolic gestures, and what those effects reveal about Washington's calculations and the wider military-industrial system that is formed around this conflict. Over the weekend, thick black smoke rose over Crimea after a Ukrainian one-way drone struck an oil facility in Sebastopol. Almost immediately, speculation followed. Was this attack encouraged, or at least politically enabled, by recent statements from U.S. officials suggesting Crimea was now considered a legitimate target? Or was it simply Ukraine responding to Russia's latest missile strikes? The drone used was what's commonly described as a kamikaze drone. It hit a single oil storage tank, igniting it. Importantly, the refinery itself remains operational. We don't know how many drones were involved, but we do know the impact was limited. And this is where context becomes essential. The fuel stored at this site is not directly connected to Russian ground operations inside Ukraine. It does not supply armored assaults or air sorties supporting frontline combat. That distinction matters. From a purely military perspective, the strike had no meaningful operational effect. Destroying one tank does not disrupt Russian logistics at scale. There are many others, and operations continue uninterrupted. At best, the strike was symbolic, an action designed to be seen rather than felt. What actually matters is not what burned on camera, but what happened quietly over the previous 48 hours. During that time, Russia clearly shifted its targeting priorities. For months, Russian forces concentrated on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Then they pivoted to systematically dismantling Ukraine's air defenses. Ukraine never had a fully integrated air defense system comparable to Russia's, but whatever capability it possessed has been steadily degraded. The objective was straightforward: achieve air superiority. By most available indicators, that goal has now been reached. And with that achieved, the next phase is unfolding. Russian strikes are now hitting an entirely different category of targets, signaling preparation for expanded ground operations once terrain conditions allow. Over the past 2 days, Russian forces have targeted concentrations of ammunition, armored vehicles, and personnel. One of the most significant strikes hit a rail yard in Kramatorsk that Ukraine had converted into a major ammunition depot. Roughly 200 tons of munitions were stored there. That depot no longer exists. Given Ukraine's already strained supply situation, this represents a serious loss. Alongside that strike, Russian forces destroyed between 20 and 40 armored vehicles. Whether these vehicles were on rail cars or staged nearby remains unclear, but the destruction itself is confirmed. Even more consequential were strikes on 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters. Reports indicate that roughly 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. This is not about counting casualties for shock value. It's about understanding what those losses represent. Ukraine is running out of experienced officers with real operational competence. Many seasoned commanders were already lost earlier in the war. These strikes didn't just kill soldiers, they shattered command structures. Entire brigades lost leadership cohesion in a matter of hours. There is also a strong possibility that NATO-aligned personnel were among those killed. British, American, or French advisors operating at increasingly tactical levels would not be surprising. Western involvement has steadily moved closer to the front lines, regardless of official denials. This is part of the reality shaping the conflict, no matter how carefully it is presented publicly. Meanwhile, across the Dnipro River near Kherson, Ukrainian forces had repositioned S-300 air defense systems, including launchers and tracking radars, supported by a Gepard anti-aircraft gun designed to counter low-flying aircraft and drones. All of it was destroyed. The radars, the launchers, the support systems, gone. Without them, Ukraine cannot provide air cover for maneuvering forces in that area. From an operational standpoint, these strikes were devastatingly effective. This contrast defines the moment. Media attention focuses on a dramatic fireball over Sevastopol, while the real story of the battlefield unfolds elsewhere. One produces compelling footage, the other determines the direction of the war. Understanding that difference is the key to understanding everything that follows. When attention stays fixed on burning fuel tanks and dramatic visuals, it hides what actually shapes outcomes on the ground. A single oil tank exploding makes for powerful television, but it does not alter the balance of power. That facility was not a critical hub feeding Russian offensives. It did not enable air operations or armored breakthroughs. It was, at most, secondary infrastructure, one tank among many, and the refinery continues to function. From a strategic perspective, this was theater presented as military success. And this pattern is not new. Again and again, even the smallest Ukrainian action is elevated into a supposed turning point. If Russian forces withdraw from a village, often because holding it offers little tactical value, headlines quickly frame it as another Ukrainian victory. But across flat terrain filled with small settlements of limited strategic importance, these shifts often mean very little. In many cases, they reflect deliberate repositioning rather than collapse. The dominant narrative rarely acknowledges that reality. The more important story lies in Russia's targeting accuracy and intelligence advantage. Russian forces demonstrated precise knowledge of where Ukrainian brigade headquarters were located. That level of accuracy is not accidental. It points to deep intelligence penetration. While the United States and its allies do provide Ukraine with high-quality intelligence, including satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, and surveillance data, the results have been uneven. Ukraine recently succeeded in striking a Russian brigade headquarters, but compare that outcome with what happened on the other side. 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters destroyed, more than 1,000 casualties, versus a single Russian headquarters targeted. The imbalance is obvious. This is not simply a question of access to information. It's about the ability to translate intelligence into coordinated action, supported by logistics, training, and experienced leadership. That is where Ukraine continues to struggle. Intelligence by itself does not win wars. It must be acted upon effectively. Leaked Pentagon documents hinted at casualty ratios of 1 Russian loss for every 7 or even 9 Ukrainian losses. If those numbers are even approximately accurate, Ukraine is being hollowed out at a rate that cannot be sustained. Linking these battlefield developments directly to statements made by U.S. officials, particularly figures like Victoria Nuland, introduces a different layer of the discussion. She is not issuing orders on the battlefield, and she does not wear a Ukrainian uniform. But dismissing her influence entirely would be naive. She has been central to shaping U.S. policy toward Ukraine for years. Her role in pushing both Kyiv and Washington toward deeper confrontation with Russia is well established. Whether she intended specific strikes or not, she belongs to the leadership class that owns the direction of this war. Another development has received remarkably little attention in Western media. Around the 1-year mark of the conflict, Russia reportedly deployed a hypersonic missile, possibly a Kinzhal, in a strike that may have hit a NATO-linked underground facility. Reports suggest significant casualties, yet coverage has been minimal. Verification has been difficult. Some sources place the strike near Kyiv, which aligns more closely with known Russian targeting patterns, while others claimed it occurred near Lviv. What we do know is that there have been no publicly acknowledged returns of American casualties. That does not rule out discrete repatriation. The silence itself is telling. Media silence is rarely accidental. There is a narrative to protect, and reports of NATO casualties inside Ukraine do not fit comfortably within it. The broader reality is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Ukraine is losing this war. That conclusion is not coming only from Moscow-aligned voices. Senior military figures in neighboring NATO countries are now saying it openly. Poland's chief of staff has repeatedly stated that Poland no longer has the ammunition reserves to sustain even a short conflict with Russia. Much of its stockpile has already been drained by support for Ukraine. More importantly, he has rejected the caricature of the Russian military as incompetent and disorganized. Instead, he describes Russian forces as capable, disciplined, and resilient. That assessment sharply contradicts the image often presented in Western media of poorly trained troops and failing command structures. As usual, reality is more complex and far less reassuring. At the same time, figures like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, complicate the picture further. His public statements are loud, confrontational, and often disruptive, but they also point to political ambition. He appears to be positioning himself for a post-war role in Russian politics. Much of his rhetoric may be less about battlefield truth and more about self-promotion. Yet President Putin's tolerance of these outbursts likely serves a function. Prigozhin's criticism places pressure on conventional military commanders without Putin needing to intervene directly. It allows internal stress to be applied while maintaining distance at the top. This suggests a system under strain, but not one collapsing, and that distinction becomes critical as the war enters its next phase. Putin's own actions reinforce this interpretation. His visits to the front lines in the south and near Belarus are not symbolic gestures or media events. They are strategic signals. He wants major operations prepared and ready to launch as soon as the ground hardens and large-scale movement becomes possible again. When Prigozhin publicly complains that neighboring units are moving too slowly, it is reasonable to assume that his frustration aligns with pressure coming from higher levels. In that sense, Prigozhin functions as a useful irritant, pushing the system forward without Putin having to issue public reprimands within Russia's military command. There has also been a notable shakeup within the Russian military structure. The chief of logistics was recently dismissed after the FSB reportedly uncovered corruption involving stolen engines from the T-14 Armata tank program. Corruption in Russia is not a new phenomenon, but the timing of this removal matters. It suggests the Kremlin was aware of the issue and chose this moment to act, likely under increasing pressure from Putin and the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov. This was not panic, it was correction. Western observers often interpret the dismissal or death of senior officers as evidence of instability. In Russian military culture, the effect is often the opposite. When generals are removed, it signals accountability. When they are wounded or killed near the front, it reinforces the idea that leadership shares risk with ordinary soldiers. That dynamic tends to build loyalty rather than undermine it. Over the past 14 to 15 months, Russia has removed a number of senior officers. These actions are not signs of collapse. They reflect adaptation under sustained pressure. This pattern reveals something deeper about how Russia manages prolonged conflict. Removing ineffective leadership strengthens the perception that the system is responsive and controlled. Internally, it sends a clear message that incompetence will not be tolerated, even during a war of attrition. Externally, it projects the image of a state actively managing the conflict rather than drifting without direction. Whether one agrees with Moscow's objectives or not, this approach has helped preserve cohesion. A recent video circulating online illustrates another widely misunderstood aspect of this war. The footage shows a Wagner Group armored personnel carrier attempting to move through deep mud near Bakhmut. The vehicle struggles through thick, waterlogged terrain that appears nearly impassable. For many Western viewers, this reinforces the idea of Russian dysfunction, but that interpretation misses the larger point. The mud affects both sides equally. It slows Russian advances and Ukrainian counteroffensives alike. Nature does not favor one army over another. This terrain has delayed the next major phase of the war for both sides. Despite these constraints, escalation continues. Within the past week, Russia launched missile strikes on Kramatorsk, reportedly killing 26 people. In response, Ukrainian military leaders declared their intention to escalate attacks on Moscow. That statement raises a critical question. Do they mean Moscow itself, the capital, or are they using Moscow as shorthand for Russian territory and military assets more broadly? The distinction matters. Russia's borders stretch for roughly 1,000 miles. Defending such a vast frontier against infiltration or covert operations is inherently difficult. Ukrainians and Russians often share ethnic, linguistic, and cultural similarities. Many Ukrainians speak fluent Russian with only subtle regional differences. That reality makes infiltration possible. The real question is not whether it can happen, but what it would accomplish. If Ukraine managed to carry out a limited strike inside Moscow, perhaps a symbolic attack causing minor damage, What would that achieve strategically? It would almost certainly harden Russian resolve, justify retaliation, and accelerate escalation. From a cost-benefit standpoint, the gains would be minimal at best. Symbolic actions rarely compensate for material losses on the battlefield. This leads directly into a far more troubling debate now taking place in Washington. Some U.S. lawmakers are openly advocating for sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. This proposal reflects a deep misunderstanding of both modern warfare and its long-term consequences. Cluster munitions are not precision weapons. They are designed to blanket wide areas with small explosive submunitions, often dispersing hundreds or even thousands at once. The danger does not end when fighting stops. Between 10 and 15% of these submunitions fail to detonate. They remain in the soil as de facto landmines, waiting for years or even decades. The United States has direct experience with this reality. During the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991, U.S. forces used cluster munitions extensively. After the war, unexploded bomblets killed and maimed both soldiers and civilians. Children were among the most frequent victims. Sending these weapons into Ukraine would leave behind a lethal legacy long after the conflict ends. The humanitarian costs would outlast any short-term battlefield effect. Presenting this as a viable solution reveals how detached policymaking has become from human reality. As the war drags on, that detachment grows more dangerous, not less. Discussions about escalation cannot be separated from the reality of attrition, and this is where the numbers become impossible to ignore. Current estimates suggest Ukraine has lost more than 10,000 armored fighting vehicles since the war began. That figure alone should force serious reflection. Armored vehicles are not easily replaced, especially for a country whose industrial base has been heavily damaged and whose supply chains rely almost entirely on external support. The obvious question is what Ukraine has gained in exchange for such losses. Territorial changes have been limited and often temporary. Politically, Ukraine is more dependent than ever. Strategically, its position has weakened. From Moscow's perspective, this confirms that its approach is working. Attrition favors the side with greater industrial capacity, deeper manpower reserves, and stronger internal cohesion. From Washington's perspective, continued aid creates the appearance of momentum, but in practice it fuels a cycle that drains Ukrainian capability far faster than Russian strength. Each destroyed vehicle becomes justification for sending more equipment. Each shipment becomes another line item in defense contracts. For the American military-industrial complex, this war is profitable. For Ukraine, it is devastating. This contradiction was exposed during recent congressional testimony by General Mark Milley. When asked why he remained confident Ukraine could still win, he pointed to Russian losses in armored vehicles. On the surface, the answer sounded reassuring. But when placed alongside the reality that Ukraine has lost more than 10,000 armored vehicles while Russia has not suffered comparable losses, the logic collapses. Confidence that is disconnected from facts becomes performance rather than analysis. In contrast, General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe, offered a more revealing assessment. He acknowledged that there is little concrete evidence showing Russia's armed forces have been severely degraded by the war. Having made that admission, he quickly shifted attention to naval and submarine warfare, likely to avoid lingering on uncomfortable conclusions. Still, the message was clear. The idea of a crippled Russian military does not align with observable reality. This marks a subtle but important shift. More officials are beginning to introduce inconvenient truths into public discussion, often indirectly. They understand that credibility requires acknowledging facts that no longer fit the established narrative. The uncomfortable truth is that this war was never solely about defending Ukrainian sovereignty. It was also meant to weaken Russia so decisively that it would no longer project power beyond its borders. That objective has failed. Russia has absorbed the pressure, adapted its tactics, and in many areas improved its operational effectiveness. At the same time, Western leaders are quietly signaling that Ukraine's prospects are bleak, not through official announcements, but through anonymous briefings and carefully worded leaks. The tone is shifting. One recent report suggested that President Zelensky has been presented with a stark choice: launch a counteroffensive or begin negotiations that would include territorial concessions. If this is accurate, it places him in an impossible position. A large-scale offensive under current conditions would likely result in catastrophic losses. Negotiations, however, would be framed as surrender or betrayal. That is not a strategy. It is abandonment disguised as choice. Former CIA analyst Ray McGovern stated this bluntly. He argued that Zelensky may not remain in power for another year, not because of Russian action, but because he could be removed by NATO interests or by Ukrainian nationalist forces who believe he failed to go far enough. In that view, Putin would not need to intervene at all. Zelensky's fate would be decided by those who once supported him or by those who see him as an obstacle. When you examine Zelensky's political rise, the pattern is familiar. Like many Western-backed leaders, he was elevated quickly, packaged as a symbol, and presented as a solution. Before entering politics, he was an entertainer, a performer whose appeal rested on media presence and populist messaging. He was supported by powerful oligarchic interests and elected on a platform centered on peace, particularly ending the conflict in Donbass. He was also a native Russian speaker, signaling reconciliation to a divided electorate. Once in office, that platform disappeared. Peace was replaced by hardline nationalism aligned with Western strategic goals. Whether that shift was voluntary or imposed matters less than the result. Voters' expectations were discarded, and the country was drawn deeper into a war it was structurally unprepared to sustain. As pressure intensifies, Zelensky's political survival becomes increasingly uncertain, and with it the stability of Ukraine's governing system. This instability is not only about one individual leader. It reflects a broader pattern seen in governments perceived as serving external agendas over domestic needs. When that perception solidifies, legitimacy erodes quickly. Whether Zelensky is eventually pushed out through political maneuvering, forced into exile, or removed by more extreme means, the underlying problem will remain. Trust, once lost, cannot be restored by foreign backing alone. This brings the discussion to a larger question that extends beyond Ukraine, the future of NATO itself. For years, NATO has presented itself as a unified and indispensable alliance, but this war has exposed fractures that were already present. The argument that the conflict in Ukraine could either fracture NATO or fundamentally change it now looks less speculative and more observable. A revealing moment came during French President Emmanuel Macron's recent meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Macron publicly stated that France would not automatically follow the United States into a war with China over Taiwan. This was not a casual remark. It directly challenged the assumption that NATO members will always align with Washington on major strategic issues. In breaking that silence, Macron shattered the illusion of automatic consensus. What followed was equally telling. Poland, long seen as one of NATO's most hawkish members and a firm supporter of U.S. leadership, suggested that Macron might have a point. The implication was subtle but profound. Europe may have relied too heavily on the United States for its security, and that dependence may now be a liability. These are not fringe voices. They come from the core of the alliance. This debate is not new. When Donald Trump was president, he openly demanded that European countries stop relying on American military power and increase their own defense spending. His tone angered many leaders, but the argument itself was simple. Why should American taxpayers indefinitely subsidize European security? While leaders objected to his style, few disputed the logic. Angela Merkel even hinted that Europe might need a more independent path. Yet in practice, little changed. Defense spending stayed low, and reliance on the United States continued. From a narrow economic perspective, that behavior is rational. If a powerful ally guarantees your security regardless of your own contribution, there is little incentive to invest more. Strategically, however, it leaves Europe dependent and immature. True autonomy requires responsibility. That will only emerge if the security guarantee weakens or disappears. Remove the assumption that the United States will always intervene and European states will be forced to adapt. That adjustment will be painful and slow, but unavoidable. Without it, NATO risks becoming an alliance in name only, a structure without shared purpose or coherent will. So will NATO survive? Possibly. but survival is not the same as relevance. The alliance may continue to exist institutionally while losing its ability to act as a unified military force. This war has accelerated that trend. It has exposed diverging interests within Europe and revealed that hostility toward Russia has often been assumed rather than carefully examined. A future European security architecture may look very different. It would not necessarily be anti-American, but it would no longer be directed entirely from Washington. It would not automatically treat Russia as an existential enemy, but would be shaped by Europe's own geographic, economic, and political realities. That shift, however, cannot occur under the current leadership class. As long as figures like Olaf Scholz remain cautious to the point of paralysis, as long as Macron speaks of autonomy while operating within old constraints, and as long as Britain behaves as if it still holds the global position it occupied in 1945, change will be limited. Leadership matters, and Europe currently lacks leaders willing to fully confront these realities. Across the Atlantic, the situation is no less constrained. In the United States, meaningful change rarely comes without crisis.